Mr Speaker, I'm very happy to stand and take a call on this piece of legislation. And it's nice to see David Carter, the Honourable David Carter, finally taking a call in this House on a piece of legislation. It's a bit of a shame that he had to nick it from Simon Bridges in the first place. It's a little bit of a shame that it took a National Party backbencher to come up with an idea, and then David Carter waded in and said, here's my opportunity to actually get on my pins and make a speech in the House, so I'm pulling rank. Thank you, Simon Bridges, but this piece of legislation is now mine. And that's all right. Good to do it before the reshuffle, Minister, I say. Always a good time to do it. And when you got Shane Ardern snapping at your heels back there, a real farmer, a real man who knows what he's talking about in this regard, very shrewd move, Minister. But poor Simon Bridges. He's not here. He's probably up in his office weeping as he hears his piece of legislation being taken through the House by the Honourable David Carter. Could have been his night. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Labor will be supporting this piece of legislation, but I want to support the comments made by my colleague Damien O'Connor and highlight the fact that while raising penalties is a good idea, the fact is that if you don't have the resources to police those penalties, then those penalties really are meaningless. And that has to be the message that comes through for this piece of legislation. Because unless those who are committing these crimes really fear that they are going to be apprehended and that those penalties may actually come to pass, then they are completely meaningless. And I urge the government to put proper resourcing into this area. Because, as we know, 20 years ago, a third of the animal welfare was done by police. It was done by the Ministry of Agriculture and the SPCA as well, but now the SPCA do up to 90%. 90%. So that's a significant shift, which shows you how the resources have come away from police doing this and taking it more seriously, or having the resources to be able to take it more seriously, to charitable organisations like the SPCA having to pick up that slack. And there was a particularly terrible case in my patch in Gisborne where the SPCA really highlighted the difficulties in raising money to carry out these prosecutions. And the SPCA had picked up 6 dogs over 2 weeks. They were absolutely skeletal. It was so extreme that they'd eaten their own faeces, which was actually just pine needles. Just pine needles. Well, I mean, this is the reality of animal cruelty in the country. They were 6 months old, but they were no bigger than 9-week-old pups. That's how incredibly emaciated they were. And one pup was so emaciated that the Gisborne Herald reported that sunlight could be seen coming through her hind legs. So that was the seriousness of the situation. And the Gisborne branch manager of the SPCA, Carol Martin, who's fantastic, said it was so important to get an ongoing prosecution fund going for the SPCA, because if it's not prosecuted, then those animals are simply returned to their owners and that abuse continues. And if this law isn't properly resourced, and if they're not able to carry out those prosecutions, then it doesn't matter how high the penalties are. And I think we need to take into account also the fact that only 0.4% of animal cruelty complaints actually result in a conviction. And that's very telling, because there is no disincentive for people when they know that less than 0.5% of all animal cruelty complaints result in a conviction. And when you look at this case in Gisborne, what the SPCA there said, that they had taken successful prosecutions in the past, but the award of costs was, and this is her words, absolutely pathetic. And they did not cover the real costs of taking a prosecution against cruelty to animals. And this is where we come to the real problem with prosecuting animal cruelty in this country. They have to look for solicitors to put their hands up to do pro bono work in order to take these prosecutions, or they go to the police and hope that the police have the resources to be able to take the prosecutions. But I think this was probably her most important comment. She said, quote, "When you head for the courts, you've already lost. If we don't educate these people, it's going to be an ongoing event." And that's the flip side of this, and as it is with any law and order issue, is you have the penalties, you have the prosecutions, but if you aren't doing the work at the other side to educate people and to intervene, then you're not going to get anywhere in that regard, Mr Speaker. And when you look at the headlines relating to animal welfare in New Zealand over the past few years in particular, where we seem to have seen an escalation. I don't know whether it's an escalation in just reporting or whether it's an actual escalation in animal welfare complaints or who knows. But the fact is they are particularly difficult to read, and they're often particularly difficult to read because they don't just involve hardened adult criminals, they involve children. And a number of the animal welfare complaints we've had in the last few years do involve children. And when I was at university and I did my science degree, and I'm running a little bit of a risk of sounding a bit like Aaron Gilmore here, but I also did criminology alongside my science degree. And I know the Axe Party and David Garrett don't like criminology, and that's probably because it's evidence-based. But the fact is that criminology shows you very, very clearly that there is an enormous connection between animal cruelty and between human violence. And this is the other reason that we need to take animal cruelty incredibly seriously, because the people who are committing it now are the future violent criminals in our country. And if we can get to them when they're committing these offences, hopefully before they commit these offences, when they show a propensity for committing these offences, then we can avoid much greater violence down the track, Mr. Speaker. And many studies in psychology and sociology and criminology, particularly in the last 25 to 30 years, have demonstrated that violent offenders frequently have childhood and adolescent histories of serious and repeated animal cruelty, of the kind that we are now unfortunately seeing in our own country in New Zealand. The FBI has recognised the connection since the 1970s. They did an analysis of serial killers which showed that nearly all of them had killed or tortured animals when they were younger. Other research has shown patterns of animal cruelty amongst perpetrators of domestic violence, child abuse and elder abuse. And in fact, it goes so far as the American Psychiatric Association considers cruelty against animals one of the diagnostic criteria of conduct disorder. So this is well documented. And we have a real opportunity here to not just pass higher sentences for something else, but to actually use this piece of legislation to look at how we can intervene. I know that the national government doesn't like early intervention. I know they like passing completely ineffective pieces of legislation like 3 strikes, completely ineffective pieces of legislation like 3 strikes, which do nothing to keep New Zealand communities safer. But here is an opportunity to actually look at early intervention. And I want to quote the Humane Society of the United States, which is the largest animal advocacy organisation in the world. And what they said was that, quote, researchers, as well as the FBI and other law enforcement agencies nationwide, have linked animal cruelty to domestic violence, child abuse, serial killings, and to the recent rash of killings by school-age children. In a study of 57 families being treated for incidents of child abuse, 88% also abused animals. And the ACT Party and the National Party are so keen on 3 strikes, well, they may be interested in the Humane Society of the United States' First Strike campaign against animal cruelty to raise awareness of this connection, Mr. Speaker. Raised awarenesses of the connection between animal cruelty and other violent crime. It helps communities to identify some of the origins of violence, to predict its patterns, to prevent its escalation, and it also works in a productive way, which is what we should be doing in this country, with animal protection agencies, shelter workers...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member, but the time has come for me to leave the chair. This debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day.